Merci beaucoup. Thank you, Philippe. So I will talk about machine learning. I'll talk about representations and learning representations. And if we're deep here, I'll explain what it means as well. So my goal is to contribute to building intelligent machines, so known as AI. And how do we get a machine to be smart, to take good decisions? Well, it needs knowledge. AI researchers from the early days, 50s, 60s, 70s, try to give the knowledge to the machine, the knowledge we have explicitly. And it didn't work quite as well as was hoped. One reason is that a lot of our knowledge is not something we can communicate verbally, that we can write down in a program. So that knowledge has to be taken somewhere else. And basically, what we have found is you can get that knowledge through observing the world around us. That means learning. Okay, so we need learning for AI. What is learning? What is machine learning? It's not about learning things by heart. That's just a flat. What it is about is generalizing from the examples you've seen to new examples. And what I like to tell my students is it's taking probability mass that is on the training examples and somehow guessing where it should go. Which new configurations of the things we see make sense or are plausible. This is what learning is about. It's guesswork. Of course, we can measure how well we're guessing. And I'll mention something about dimensionality and geometry that comes up when you think about this problem. And one of the messages will be that we can maybe fight this dimensionality problem by allowing the machine to discover underlying causes, underlying factors that explain the data. And this is a little bit what deep learning is about. So let's start from learning, an easy form of learning. Let's say we observe XY pairs where X is a number, Y is a number, and the stars here represent the examples we've seen of XY configurations. So we want to generalize to new configurations. In other words, for example, in this problem, typically we want to predict a Y given a new X. And there is an underlying relationship between Y and X, maybe the expected value of Y given X, which is given with this purple curve, but we don't know it. That's the problem with machine learning. We're trying to discover something we don't know already. And we can guess some function. This is the predicted or learned function. So how can we go about this? One of the most basic principles by which machine learning algorithms are able to do this is assume something very simple about the world around us, about the data we're getting, or the function we're trying to discover. It's just assuming that the function we're trying to discover is smooth, meaning if I know the value of the function at some point x, and I want to know the value at some nearby point x prime, then it's reasonable to assume that the value at x prime of the function we want to learn is close to the value at x. That's it. I mean, you can formalize that mathematically in many different ways and exploit it in many ways. And what it means here is if I ask you what y should be at this point, what I can do is look up the value of y that I observed at nearby points, and combining these, make a reasonable guess like this one. And if I do that on problems like this, it's actually going to work quite well. And a lot of, I would say, a large fraction of the applications of machine learning use this principle, and even often just this principle. But if we only rely on this principle for generalization, we're going to be in trouble. That's part of one of the messages I want to explain here. So why are we going to be in trouble? Well, basically we're doing some kind of interpolation. So if I see enough examples, the green stars here, to cover the ups and downs of the function I'm trying to learn, then I'm going to be fine. But what if the function I want to learn has many more ups and downs than I can possibly observe through data, because even Google has a finite number of examples. Even if you have millions or billions of examples, the functions we want to learn for AI are not like this one. They have a number of configurations of variables of interest that may be exponentially large. So something maybe bigger than the number of atoms in the universe. So there's no way we're going to have enough examples to cover all the configurations. For example, think of the number of different English sentences, which is something that Google is interested in, of course. And this problem is illustrated by the so-called curse of dimensionality, where you consider what happens when you have not just one variable, but many variables and all of their configurations. How many configurations of n variables do you have? Well, you have an exponential number of configurations. So if I want to learn about a single variable, and I can just divide, let's say it's a real valuable variable, and I divide its value into intervals, and I count how many of those bins I've seen in my data, I can estimate probability of different intervals coming up. So that's easy because I only want to know about a small number of different configurations. But if I'm looking at two variables, then the number of configurations may be to the square bigger, and if I have 3, it may be even more. But typically I'm going to have hundreds. If you think about images, it's thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. So it's crazy how many configurations there are. All right, so how do we possibly generalize to new configurations? We cannot just break up the space into small cells and count how many things happen in each cell, because the new examples that we want to care, the new configurations that we're going to be asked about, might be in some region where we haven't seen no example. So that's the problem of generalizing non-locally. So there's one thing that can help us, but it's not going to be sufficient. It's something that happens with AI problems very often, like machine vision, natural language processing and understanding, and many other problems, where the set of configurations of variables that are plausible, that can happen in the real world, occupy a very small volume of all this set of possible configurations. So let me give an example. In images, if I choose the pixels in an image randomly, in other words, if I sample an image from a completely uniform distribution, I'm going to get things like this, just white noise. And I can repeat this for eons and eons, and I'm never going to sample something that looks like a face. So what it means is that faces, images of faces, are very rare in the space of images. They occupy a very small volume, much less than what this picture would suggest. And so this is a very important hint. It means that actually the task is to find out where this distribution concentrates. I have another example here. If you take the image of a 4, like this one, and you do some geometric transformations to it, like rotating it, scaling it, you get slightly different images. And if you, at each point, you allow yourself to make any of these transformations, you can create a so-called manifold, so a surface of possible images. Each point here corresponds to a different image. And the number of different changes you can make is basically the dimensionality of this manifold. So in this case, even though the data lives in a high dimensional space, the actual variations we care about are of low dimensionality. And knowing that, we can maybe do better in terms of learning. One thing about the curse of dimensionality is I don't like the name curse of dimensionality, because it's not really dimensionality. You can have many dimensions but have a very simple function. What really matters is how many variations does the function have, how many ups and downs. So we actually had some theoretical results about the number of examples you would need if you were only relying on this smoothness assumption essentially is linear in the number of ups and downs of the function you want to learn. Okay, so let's come back to this idea of learning where to put probability maps. So in machine learning, what we have is data. Each example is a configuration of variables. And we know that this configuration occurred in the real world. So we can say the probability for this configuration. So this is the space of configuration I'm showing in 2D. So we know that this configuration is plausible, is likely. So we can just put a peak of probability here. And we can put a peak at every example. The question is, how do we take this probability mass and sort of give a little bit of that to other places? In particular, we'd like to put mass in between. If there really was a manifold that has some structure and we could discover that structure, it would be great. So sort of the classical machine learning way of doing things is say that the distribution function, the function that we're trying to learn in this case, is smooth. So if it's very probable here, it must be also probable in the neighborhood. So we can just do some mathematical operation that will shift some mass from here to their neighborhoods. And we get a distribution like this as our model. And that works reasonably well, but it's not the right thing to do. It's putting mass in many directions we don't care about. Instead, what we want to do is to discover that there is something about this data, there is some structure, there is some abstraction that allows us to be very specific about where we're going to put probability mass. And we might discover something like this, which in 2D doesn't look like a big difference, but in high dimensions, the number of directions you're allowed to move here is very small compared to the number of dimensions here, and the volume goes exponentially with dimensions, so you can have a huge gain by guessing properly in which directions things move, are allowed to keep high probability. All right, so now to the core of this presentation, which is about representation learning. I have talked about learning in general and some of the issues, some of the challenges with applying learning to AI. Now, when you look at how machine learning is applied in industry, what people do for 90% of the time, what they do with the effort of engineers is not really improve machine learning. They use existing machine learning, but to make the machine learning algorithms work well, they do so-called feature engineering. So that means taking the raw data and transforming it, extracting some features, deciding what matters, throwing away the things we think don't matter. And that's essentially using humans and our intelligence and our understanding of the problem to figure out the factors that matter, to figure out the dependencies that matter, and so on. So what representation learning is about is trying to do with machines what humans do right now, which is extracting those features, discovering what is a good representation for your data. And one way to think about it is the machine is trying to guess not just those features, so those computations that are useful for us to explain the variations, but really what are the underlying factors that explain the data? What are the underlying causes? And the guesses about what these are for a particular example is exactly what we'd like to have as our representation. Of course, this is hard to define because we don't know what the right factors are, what the right causes are, but this is the objective we have. This is Dave, by the way. So there is a very old family of algorithms, as Shivo mentioned, called neural nets that have been around since at least those that have multiple levels like this that have been around since the 80s. And they have multiple layers of computations. And one of the things I've been trying to do is to define some properties that they have that other algorithms may have that may be useful, and try to understand why these properties are useful. In particular, there's this notion of depth. So the idea of deep learning is that not only are we going to have representations of the data that are going to be learned, but we're going to have multiple levels of representation. And why would it matter to have multiple levels of representation? Because we're going to have low-level and high-level representations, where high-level representations are going to be more abstract, more nonlinear, capture structure that is less obvious in the data. So what we call deep learning is when the learning algorithm can discover these representations and even decide how many levels there should be. All right, so I mentioned neural nets as the original example of deep learning. What these algorithms do is they learn some computation, some function that takes an input vector and map it to some output, which could be a vector, through different levels of representation, where each level is composed of units which do a computation that's inspired by how the neurons in the brain work. So they have a property which you don't find in many learning algorithms called distributed representation. So let's first see how these other learning algorithms work, how they generalize. Remember, this is going to be very similar to what I talked about with the smoothness assumption. They rely on the smoothness assumption. Deep learning also relies on the smoothness assumption, but introduces additional knowledge, if you want. So when you only rely on the smoothness assumption, the way you work is you essentially take your input space, still the same space, and break it up into regions. For example, this is what happens with clustering, nearest neighbors, many SVMs, many classical, statistical, non-parametric algorithms, decision trees, and so on. So what happens is, after seeing the data, you break up the input space into regions, and you generalize locally. So what if you have a function that outputs something here, because you've seen an example here, for example, you can generalize and say, well, in the neighborhood, the output is going to be similar, and maybe some kind of interpolation with the neighboring regions is going to be performed. But the crucial point from a mathematical point of view is that there's a counting argument here, which is how many parameters, how many degrees of freedom do we have to define this partition? Well, basically, you need at least one parameter per region. The number of parameters is going to grow with the number of regions. If I want to distinguish two regions, I need to say where the first one is, or how to separate between these two. And for example, I could imagine specifying the center of each region. So the number of things I have to specify from the data is essentially equal to the number of regions I can distinguish. Okay, so you can think, well, there's no other way you could do that, right? I mean, how could you possibly create a new region for which you have not seen any data and distinguish it meaningfully? Well, you can. Let me give you an example. So this is what happens with distributed representations, which happen in things like factor models, PCA, RVM, neural nets, sparse coding, and deep learning. What you're going to do is you're going to still break up the input space into regions and be able to generalize locally in the sense that things that are nearby are going to have similar outcomes. But the way you're going to learn that is completely different. So, for example, you can imagine, again, this is the input space. What I'm going to do is I'm going to break it down in different ways that are not mutually exclusive. So here, what I'm thinking about when I'm building this model is there are three factors that explain the two inputs that I'm seeing. So this is a two-dimensional input space, and I'm breaking the space into different regions. So for example, the black line here tells me that you're either on that side of it or the other side of it. On that side, C1 equals 1. On that side, C1 equals 0. So this is a bit that tells me whether I'm in this set or this set. And I have this other bit that tells me whether I'm on this set and this set or that set. And now you can see that the number of regions I can define in this way could be much larger than the number of parameters, because the number of parameters grows linearly with the number of factors, the number of these hyperplanes. So by being smart about how you define those regions, by allowing the combinatorics to help us, you can get potentially exponential gain in expressive power. Of course, from the machine learning point of view, this comes with an assumption. The assumption is that when I learn about being on that side or that side, it's meaningful independently in some sense, not quite in the statistical sense, of what happens with the other configurations, the other hyperplane. So that makes sense if you think of, okay, this is images, and this one is telling me, is this a male or a female? This one's telling me, does he wear glasses or not? Is he tall or short, or something like that. So if you think about these factors as semantically meaningful things, usually you can vary them independently, like causes that explain the world around us. And that's why you're able to generalize you're assuming something about the world that gives you a kind of exponential power of representation. Now, of course, in the real world, the features we care about, the factors we care about, are not going to be simple linear separators. So that's why we want deep representation. That's one reason why we need deep representations. Otherwise, just a single level would be enough. All right, let me move on because time is flying. So this is stolen from my brother Sami, who gave a talk here not long ago, where they use this idea of representations in a very interesting way, where you have data of two different modalities. You have images, you have images and you have text queries, short sequences of words. And they learn a representation for images, so they map the image to some 100-dimensional vector, and they learn a function that represents queries, so they map query to this also 100-dimensional point in the same space, and they learn them in such a way that when someone types dolphin and then is shown an image of a dolphin and then clicks on it, the representation for the image and the representation for the query end up close to each other. And in this way, they can, once you've learned that, you can of course do all kinds of interesting things like answering new queries you've never seen, and find images that match queries that somehow you haven't seen before. All right, one question that people outside of machine learning ask when they consider what people in machine learning are doing is, this is crazy. I mean, humans can learn from very few examples, and you guys need thousands or millions of examples. I mean, you're doing something wrong. And they're right. So how do humans manage to possibly learn something very complicated from just a few examples? Like, how do students learn something? Well, there are a number of answers. One is brains don't start from scratch. They have some priors. And in particular, I'm interested in generic priors that allow us to generalize to things that evolution was not, didn't train our species to do, but still we do very well. So we have some very general purpose priors that we are born with, and I'd like to figure out which they are, because we can exploit them as well. Also, and this is very, very important, if you ask a newborn to do something, it wouldn't work very well. But of course, an adult has learned a lot of things before you give him a few examples. And so he's transferring knowledge from previous learning. This is crucial. And the way he's doing that is he's built in his mind representations of the objects, of the types, of the modalities that in which you're giving him the examples. And these representations capture the relationships between the factors, the explanatory factors that explain what is going on in your particular setup of the new task. And he's able to do that from unlabeled data, from examples that were unrelated to the task we're trying to solve. So what humans, one of the things that humans are able to do is to do what's called semi-supervised learning. They're able to use examples from, that are not specifically for the task you care about to generalize. They're able to use information about the structure of, the statistical structure of the things around us to quickly answer new questions. So here, let's say someone give me just two examples. We want to discriminate between the green and the blue, and a classical algorithm would just do something like, put a straight line in between. But what if you knew that there are all these other points that are not maybe even related to your task, but these are the configurations that are plausible in the input distribution. So those black ones, you don't know if they're green or blue. But by the structure here, you would guess that these ones are all blue and these ones are all green. And so you would put your decision like this. So we're trying to take advantage of data from other tasks that are unlabeled to find something generic about the world, like variations usually happen in this direction, and use that to quickly generalize from very few examples to new examples. Okay. So, of the motivations for learning about depth, there are vertical motivations that come from the discovery of families of functions, mathematical functions, that can be represented very efficiently if you allow the representation to have multiple levels, but might require exponentially more numbers, bigger representations, if you only allow 1 or 2 levels. Even though 1 or 2 levels are enough to represent any function, it might be very inefficient. And of course, there are biological motivations, like the brain seems to have a deep architecture. This is especially true of the visual cortex, which is the part we understand best. And that the cortex seems to have a generic learning algorithms, which the same sort of principles seem to be at work in terms of learning everywhere in cortex. Finally, there are cognitive motivations, like the fact that we learn simpler things first, and then we compose these simpler things to build higher-level abstractions. This has been exploited, for example, in the work done at Stanford by Onlai Lee and Druin and others, to show how these deep learning representations can learn simple things like edges, combine them to form parts, combine them to form faces, and things like that. Another sort of simple motivation is, how do we program computers? Do we program computers by having a main program that has a bunch of lines of code? Or do we program computers by having functions or subroutines that call subroutines that call subroutines? Right? This is the way we program. If we were forced to program it that way, it wouldn't work very well. But most of machine learning is basically trying to solve AI using this. Not in the programs they use, but in the structure of the functions that are learned. There are also, of course, motivations from looking at what can be achieved by exploring depth. So I'm stealing this slide from another Google talk by Jeff Hinton last summer, which shows how deep nets, compared to the standard way, which has been the state of the art in speech recognition for 30 years, can be substantially improved by exploiting these multiple levels of representation. Even, and this is something new that impresses me a lot, even when the amount of data available is huge, there can be a gain in using these representation learning algorithms. And this all comes from something that happened in 2006, when first Jeff Hinton, followed by a group here in Montreal and Yann Lequin's group in NYU in New York, found that you could actually train a deep neural network by using a few simple tricks. And the simple tricks is essentially that we're going to train layer by layer using unsupervised learning, although recent work now allows us to train deep networks without this trick and using other tricks. This has given rise to lots of industrial interests, as I mentioned, not only in speech recognition, but also in computer vision, for example. I'm going to talk about some competitions we've won using deep learning. So last year we won a so-called transfer learning competition where you're trying to take representations learned from some data and apply them on other data that relates to similar but different tasks. And so there was one competition where the results were announced at ICML 2011, and another one at NIPS 2011, so this is a bit less than a year ago. And what we see in those pictures is how the accuracy improves with more layers, but more precisely, each of these graphs has on the x-axis the log of the number of labeled examples used for training the machine. And what you see is that as you, and the y-axis is accuracy, essentially. So you want this to be high. And for this task, as you add more levels of representation, what happens is you especially get better in the case where you have very few labeled examples. The thing I was talking about that humans can do so well, generalized from very few examples, because they've learned representation earlier on using lots of other data. One of the learning algorithms that came out of my lab that has been used for this is called the denoising autoencoder. And what it does, in principle, is pretty simple. to learn a representation, you take each input example and you corrupt it by, say, setting some of the inputs to 0 randomly. And then you learn a representation so that you can reconstruct the input, but you want to reconstruct the uncorrupted input, the clean input. That's why it's called denoising. And then you try to make this as close as possible to, this as close as possible to the raw uncorrupted input. And we can show this essentially models the density of the input distribution. And you can learn these representations and stack them on top of each other. How am I doing with time?
6:19.
Huh?
6:19.
I have until when?
Just keep going.
Okay, good. All right. Well, you should have not said that. You'll regret it. Okay, so I want to make here a connection between those denoising autoencoders and the manifold learning idea that I was mentioning earlier. So how do these algorithms discover the manifolds, the regions where the configurations of input variables are plausible, where the distribution concentrates? So we're back to the same picture as before. So these are our examples. And what we're trying to do is to learn a representation, so a mapping from the input space, so here that will be 2D, to a new space, such that we can essentially recover the input. In other words, we don't lose any information. But at the same time, because of the denoising part, actually you can show that what this is trying to do is throw away all the information. So it seems crazy, right? You want to keep all the information, but you want to throw away all the information. But there's a catch. Here you want to only be able to reconstruct these examples, not necessarily any configuration of the inputs. So you're trying to find a function which will preserve the information about these guys, for these guys, in other words, is able to reconstruct them, like the identity function, for when it's applied on these guys. But when you apply it in other places, it's allowed to do anything it wants. And so, in order to, and it's also learning a smooth function. So in order to do that, let's see what happens. Let's consider a particular point here, a particular example. It needs to distinguish this one from its neighbor in the representation you're going to learn. So the representation you can learn for that guy has to be different enough from that guy that we can actually recover and distinguish this one from this one. So we can learn an inverse mapping, approximate inverse mapping from the representation. Okay, so that means you have to have a representation which is sensitive to changes in that direction. So when I move slightly from here to here, the representation has to change slightly as well. On the other hand, if I move in this direction, then the representation doesn't need to capture that. It could be constant as I move in that direction. In fact, it wants to be constant in all directions, but what's going to happen is it's going to be constant in all directions except the directions that it actually needs to reconstruct the data. And in this way, you recover the directions that are the derivatives of this representation function, and you recover the directions of the manifold, the directions where if I move in this direction, I stay in the region of high probability. That's what the manifold really means. Okay, so we can get rid of this direction. Recently we came up with an algorithm that you can use to sample from a model. So if you have an understanding of the manifold as something that tells you at each point, these are the directions you're allowed to move so as to stay in high probability region. So these are the directions that keep you tangent to the manifold. Then basically the algorithm goes, well, we are at the point, we move in the directions that our algorithm discovered to be good directions of change, plausible directions of change. And that might correspond to something like taking an image and translating it, or rotating it, or doing something like removing a part of an image. And then projecting back towards the manifold. It turns out that the reconstruction function does that. And then iterating that random walk to get samples from the model. And we applied this to modeling faces and digits. Now, let's come back to this question of what is a good representation. People in computer vision have used this term invariance a lot. And it's a word that's used a lot when you handcraft features. So I remember at the beginning I said the way most of machine learning is applied is you take your raw data and you handcraft features based on your knowledge of what matters and what doesn't matter. For example, if your input is images, you'd like to design features that are going to be insensitive to translations of your input. Because typically the category you're trying to detect should not depend on a small translation. So this is the idea of invariant features. But if we want to do unsupervised learning, where no one tells us ahead of time what matters and what doesn't matter, what the task is going to be, then how do we know which invariance matters? For example, let's say we're doing speech recognition. Well, if you're doing speech recognition, then you want to be invariant to who the speaker is. And you want to be invariant to what kind of microphone it is and what's the volume of the sound. But if you're doing speaker identification, then you want to be invariant to what the person says, and you want to be very sensitive to the identity of the person. But if someone gives you speech and you don't know if it's going to be used for recognition of phonemes or for recognizing people, what should you do? Well, what you should be doing is learning to disentangle factors, basically discovering that in speech, the things that matter are the phonemes, the person, the microphone, and so on. These are the factors that you'd like to discover automatically. And if you're able to do that, then my claim is you can essentially get around the curse of dimensionality. You can solve very hard problems. All right. There's something funny that happens with the deep learning algorithms I was talking about earlier, which is that if you train these representations from purely unsupervised learning, you discover that the features, the representation that they find, have some form of disentangling, that some of the units in the neural net are very sensitive to some of the underlying factors, and they're very sensitive to one factor and very insensitive to other factors. So this is what disentangling is about. But no one told these algorithms what those factors would be in the first place. So something good is happening, but we don't really understand why. And we'd like to understand why. One of the things that you see in many of these algorithms is the idea of so-called sparse representations. So what is that? Well, up to now I've talked about representations as just a bunch of numbers that we associate to an input. But one thing we could do is learn representations that have the property that many of those numbers happen to be zero, or some constant other value. The zero is very convenient. And it turns out when you do that, it helps a lot, at least for some problems. So that's interesting. And I conjecture that it helps us disentangle the underlying factors in the problems where basically, for any example, there are only a few concepts and factors that matter. So in the scene that I see right now that comes to my eyes, of all the concepts that my brain knows about, only a few are relevant to this scene. And it's true of almost any input that comes to my sensors. So it makes sense to have representations that have this property as well, that even though we have a large number of possible features, most of them are sort of not applicable to the current situation. Not applicable, we're going to say zero. So just by forcing many of these features to output not applicable, somehow we're getting better representations. This has been used in a number of papers, and we've used it with so-called rectifier neural networks, in which the unit compute a function like this on top of the usual linear transformation that we perform. And the result is that this function is just max of 0x. So when x here is some weighted sum from the previous layer, what happens is either the output is a positive real number or the output is 0. So let's say the input was a sort of random centered around 0, then half of the time those features would output 0. And if you just learn to shift this a little bit to the left, then 80% of the time or 95% of the time the output will be 0. So it's very easy to get sparsity with these kind of nonlinearities. It turns out that these nonlinearities are sufficient to learn very complicated things. And that was used in particular in a really outstanding system built by Alex Krzyzewski and here and Ilya Sutskever with Jeff Hinton in Toronto recently, where they obtained amazing results on one of the benchmarks that computer vision people really care about, called ImageNet with 1,000 classes. So this contains millions of images taken from Google image search and 1,000 classes that you're trying to classify. So these are images like this, and there are 1,000 different categories you want to detect. And this shows some of the outputs of this model, where it's obviously going well. And they managed to bring the state of the art from making small incremental changes from, say, 27% to 26% down to 17% on this particular benchmark. That's pretty amazing. And one of the tricks they used, I'm doing publicity for, is called dropouts. And Jeff Hinton is speaking a lot about this this year. Next year will be something else. And it's a very nice trick. Basically, the idea is add some kind of randomness in the typical neurons we use. You'd think that randomness hurts, right? So if we learn a function, say thinking about the brain computing something, if you add noise in the computations of the brain, you'd think it hurts. But actually, when you do it during training, it helps. And it helps for reasons that are yet to be completely understood, but the theory is it prevents the features you learn to depend too much on the presence of the other. So half of the features will be turned off by this trick. So the idea is you take the output of a neuron and you multiply it by 1 or 0 with probability 1/2. So you turn off half of the features randomly. We do that for all the layers. And however, at test time, you don't do this random thing. You just multiply by 1/2. So in average, it's the same thing. But what happens is during training, the features learn to be more robust and more independent of each other and collaborate in a less fragile way. This is actually similar to the denoising autoencoder I was talking about earlier, where we introduce corruption noise in the input. But here you do it at every layer. And somehow this very simple trick helps a lot in many contexts. So they've tested it on different benchmarks. These are 3 image data sets and also on speech. And in all cases, they've seen improvements. So let's get back to the representation learning algorithms. They are based on, many of them are based on learning one layer of representation at a time. And one of the algorithms that has been very popular for doing that is called the restricted Boltzmann machine, or RBM. And as a probability model, it's formalized in this way. Basically, we're trying to model the distribution of the vector x, which is considered a vector of bits typically, but it could be real numbers. And we introduce a vector of bits h, and we consider the joint distribution of these vectors that follows some formula. We're trying to find the parameters in the formula, like the b, the c, and the w, so that p of x is as large as possible. It turns out that in this model that's been very popular for deep learning, you need to sample from the model. In other words, the model is representing a distribution, and you'd like to generate examples according to what the model thinks is plausible. And in principle, there are ways to do that. You can do things like dip sampling. However, what we and others have found is that these sampling algorithms, based on the Monte Carlo Markov chain method, have some quirks. They don't do exactly what we would like. In particular, we say they don't mix well. So what does that mean? For example, if you start a chain of samples, so you're going to create a sequence of samples by making small changes. That's what what they call the Markov chain methods do. Well, it turns out that you get chains like this where it stays around the same kind of examples. So it doesn't move to like a new category. Where you'd like your sampler, your generative algorithm, to be able to visit all the plausible configurations and be able to jump from one configuration, from one region in configuration space to another one, or at least have a chance to visit all the places that matter. But there's a reason why this is happening, and I'm going to try to explain it with a picture. So first of all, as I mentioned, MCMC methods move in configuration space by making small steps. You start from a configuration of the examples. Let's say where I'm sitting is a configuration of XY coordinates, and I'm going to make small steps such that if I'm in a configuration of high probability, I'm going to move to another high probability configuration. And if I'm in a low probability configuration, I'm going to tend to move to a neighboring high probability configuration. In this way, you stay in sort of high probability regions, and you, in principle, can visit the whole distribution. But you can see there's a problem. If this white thing here is highly probable, and the black thing there is highly probable, and the gray stuff in the middle is very implausible, how could I possibly make small moves to go from here to here, from the white to the black? So this is illustrated in the picture like this. In this case, this is a density. Okay, so the input is representing different configurations of the variables of interest. And this is what the model thinks that the distribution should be. So it gives high probability in some places. So these are what we call modes. It's a region that has a peak. And this is another mode, so this distribution has two modes. The question is, can we go from mode to mode and make sure to visit all the modes? And the MCMC is making small steps. Now, so long as the MCMC can go through these intermediate regions and they have enough probability, it can move around here and then quickly go through these and do a lot of steps here and go back, and in this way assemble all the configurations with roughly the right probability. The problem is, remember I said at the beginning that there's this geometry where the AI problems have this property that the things we care about, like images, occupy a very small volume in the space of configurations of pixels. So the right distribution that we're trying to learn is one that has very big peaks where there's a lot of probability, and in most other places the probability will be tiny, 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 exponentially small. So we're trying to make moves between these modes, but now these modes are separated by vast empty spaces, deserts of probability, where it's impossible to cross unless you make huge jumps. Okay, so that's a really big problem, because when we consider algorithms like the RBM, the way what's going on is, for learning, we need to sample from the model. Initially, when a model starts learning, it says, I don't know anything, I'm assigning a kind of uniform probability to everything. So the model thinks everything is uniform, the probability is the same for everything, so it's easy to move everywhere. And as it keeps learning, it starts developing these peaks, these modes. But still, there's a way to go from mode to mode and go through reasonably probable configurations. As learning becomes more advanced, you see these peaks emerge. And now, it becomes impossible to cross. Unfortunately, we need the sampling to learn these algorithms. And so there's a chicken and egg problem. We need the sampling, but if the sampling doesn't work well, the learning doesn't work well, and so we can't make progress. So the one thing I want to talk about is a direction of solution for this problem that we've been starting to explore in my lab. And it involves exploiting, guess what? Deep representations. The idea is, instead of doing these steps in the original space of the inputs where we observe things, if we did the MCMC in abstract, high-level representation, maybe things would be easier. So let's consider, for example, something not too complicated like images of digits. If we had a machine that had discovered that the factors that matter for these images is something like, okay, what's the background? Is the background black and the foreground white, or vice versa? So this is one bit that says flip black and white. And is the category 0, 1, 2, 3, so that's just 10 bits that tell us what the category is. And what's the position of the digit in the image? Well, so these are high-level factors you could imagine that the learner could discover. And if it would discover these things, then if you represent the image in that space, the MCMC would be much easier. In particular, you could go from, say, one of these guys to these guys directly, simply because maybe these are the zeros and these are the threes. And there's one bit that allows you to flip, or two bits that allow you to flip from 0 to 3. So in the space where my representation has a bit for 0, a bit for 3, I just need to flip 2 bits. And that's easy. It's a small move in that space. In the space of abstract representations, it's easy to generate data, whereas in the original space, it's difficult. One way to see this visually is to interpolate between examples at different levels of representation. So this is what we've done. So if you look in the pixel space and you interpolate between this 9, this picture of a 9, and this picture of a 3, a linear interpolation, what you see is between the image of a 9 and the image of a 3, you have to go in between through images that don't look like anything. I mean, don't look like a digit, the things that the model is seeing. And so the MCMC, if it walks, oh, that's a plausible thing. Oh no, this is not very plausible. Oh, this is worse. I'm coming back. So it's never going to go on the other side of this desert of probability. So this is a one-dimensional instantiation of the example I was trying to explain. Now, what you see with the other two lines is the same thing, but at different levels of representation that has been learned using supervised learning. And what you see is that it has learned a representation which has kind of skewed the space so that somehow I can make lots of small changes, and stay in a 3, and then suddenly just few pixels flip and it becomes a 9 magically. And so I don't have to stay very long in the low probability region. In fact, it's not even so implausible. And you can move, all of these moves are rather plausible, and so you can smoothly move from mode to mode without having to go through these low probability regions. So it's not like it actually discovered these actual bits, but it's discovered something that makes the job of sampling easier. And we've done experiments to validate that. So the general idea is, instead of sampling in the original space, we're going to learn these representations and then do our sampling, which kind of iterates between representations in that high-level space. And then once we've found something in that abstract representation, we can learn, because we have inverse mappings, we can map back to the input space and get, say, the digit we care about or the face we care about. So we've applied this, for example, to face images. And what we find is that, for example, the red here uses a deep representation, and the blue here uses a single layer RBM. And what we find is that it can, for the same number of steps, it can visit more modes, more classes, by having a deeper representation. All right, so I'm almost done. What I would like you to keep in mind is that machine learning involves really interesting fundamental challenges that have a geometric nature in particular, and that in order to face those challenges, something we found very useful is to allow machines to look for abstraction, to look for high-level representations of the data. And I think that we've only scratched the surface of this idea that the algorithms we have now discover still rather low-level abstractions. And there's a lot more that could be done if we're able to discover even higher-level abstractions. Ideally, what the high-level abstractions do is disentangle, separate out the different underlying factors that explain the data. The factors we don't know, but we'd like the machine to discover. Of course, if we know the factors, we can somehow cheat and give that to the machine by telling it, here are some random variables that we know about, and here are some values of these variables in such and such setting. But we're not going to be able to do that for everything. We need machines that can make sense of the world by themselves somehow, to some extent. So we've shown that more abstract representations give rise to successful transfer. So being able to generalize to new domains, new languages, new classes, and we've won international competitions using these tricks. I'm done. Thank you very much. Before I take questions, I would like to thank members of my team, so the Lisa Lab, who've been, of course, very important for my work. And I'm open to questions. Yes, so there's a microphone.
Hi. So the problem you mentioned with the KIP sampling, isn't that easily solved by just random restarts?
No. We've tried that.
And I mean, every time you randomly restart, you're gonna be maybe if you're gonna be
So the problem,
stuck in
what happens is, if you randomly restart, what's typically going to happen is your walk is going to bring you to to a few of the modes, always the same ones, right? And so you're not going to visit everything.
So why would it bring you always to the same mode?
Because you have to think of, it's like a dynamical system, right? So most routes go to Rome for some reason. Or
Well, if
a few
you're
big
close to
cities.
Paris, you'll go to Paris.
If most routes go to a few big cities. That's what happens in these algorithms. We obviously tried this because you think, wow, that should work. There was a question right here.
So I was just wondering about sampling from the model. I thought that was interesting, the way at different levels of abstraction you could sort of bridge that space.
Yeah.
So you're able to visit more classes, but does that make the sort of distinction between those classes more, like it seems to be bringing those classes closer together, so in terms of being able then to distinguish.
We had trouble understanding what was going on there. Because you'd think if the picture to look is, think if somehow we made the 3s and the 9s closer, it should now be harder to discriminate between them. Whereas before we had this big empty region where we could put our separator. So I don't have a complete answer to this, but it's because we're working with these high-dimensional spaces that things are not necessarily as our intuition would suggest. What happens really is that the manifold, so that the regions where, say, the 3s are, is a really complicated curvy surface in high-dimensional space. And so is the 9. And in the original space, these curvy spaces are intertwined in complicated ways, which mean machine learning has a hard time separating between 9s and 3s. Even though there's lots of space in between 9s and 3s, it's not like you have 9s here and 3s here. It's a complicated thing. And what we do when we move to these high representations is flatten those surfaces. And now if you interpolate between points, you kind of stay in high probability configurations. So this flattening, the flattening also means that it's easier to separate them. Even though they may be closer, it's easier because you need a simpler surface is enough. This is a conjecture I'm making. I haven't actually seen in these high-dimensional spaces, but this is what my mind makes of it. Cool.
So my understanding is that you don't give any clue to the algorithm of what the representations will be.
We would like to have algorithms that could learn from as little cue as possible.
So did you, on some of your results, my understanding is that you worked on images, on voices, or
yes.
on writing recognition.
Yes.
Did you try to understand what were the representations that the algorithm produced?
Yes.
And did you try from that to understand if humans were using also these same representations, or if the representations could be different between these algorithms and humans?
Well, first of all, we don't know what humans use, but we can guess, right? So, for example, I showed early on the results of modeling faces from Stanford, where, and other people have found the same, but I'll use that picture, that these deep learning algorithms discover representations that, at least for the first two levels, seem to be similar to what you see in the visual cortex. So if you look at V1, the major first area of visual cortex where signals arrive, you actually see neurons that detect or are sensitive to exactly the same kinds of things. And in the second layer, and V2 is not a layer really, it's an area, well, you don't see these things, but you see combinations of edges, and the same group has actually compared what the neurons in the brain seem to like according to neuroscientists with what the machine learning models discover, and they found some similarities. But other things you can do that I mentioned quickly was, in some cases we know what the factors are, we know what humans will look for. So you can just try to correlate the features that have been learned with the factors you know humans think are important. So we've done that in the work here with Xavier Laurel on board. That's not the one I want to show. It's just the right guys, but sorry. Yes, this one. Okay, so for example, we've trained models on problem of sentiment analysis, where you give them a sentence, and you're trying to predict the person liked or didn't like something, like a book or a video or a meal or something you find on the web. And what we found is that when we use purely unsupervised learning, so it doesn't know that the job is to do sentiment analysis. Some of the features specialize on the sentiment. Is this more or less more positive or more negative kind of statement? And some features specialize on the domain, because we train this across 25 different domains. So some basically detect or are highly correlated with, is this about books, is this about food, is this about videos, is this about music? So these are underlying factors we know are present in the data, and we find that the features tend to specialize towards these things, much more than the original input.
Moi, j'aimerais savoir, versus une approche avec une conceptualisation accrochée après ces modèles-là. Est-ce qu'on pourrait, par exemple, avoir, lorsque vous parlez de training dans votre espace, on ne sait pas qu'est-ce qu'il y a. Si on a déjà des modèles qui sont préétablis, mettons, je pourrais donner par exemple, conceptuellement, une face, elle a deux yeux, un nez, une bouche. Donc, si on a déjà des pré-modèles qu'on a déjà, d'une certaine façon, training ce modèle-là pour avancer vers ce modèle-là. On pourrait avoir aussi d'autres modèles comme, par exemple, des ombres. Est-ce qu'on élimine des ombres en recherchant des faces, des visages? Est-ce que cet étage de méta-conceptualisation ou conceptualisation des modèles à utiliser, c'est une approche qui serait peut-être plus rapide que d'avoir d'explorer un plus grand espace de façon présente, si on pourrait dire.
Right. So I'm going to summarize your question in English and answer in English if you don't mind. So my understanding of the question is, could we just not use our knowledge, our prior knowledge, to build in the appropriate structure and appropriate representations and so on? And my answer to this is, of course, this is what we do. I mean, this is what everybody in machine learning does. And it's especially true in computer vision, where we use a lot of prior knowledge of our understanding of how vision works. But my belief is that it's also interesting to see whether machines could discover these things by themselves. Because if we have algorithms that can do that, then we can still use our prior knowledge, but we can discover other things that we didn't know, or that we were not able to formalize. And with these algorithms, actually, it's not too difficult to put in prior knowledge. You can add extra random variables that correspond to the things you know matter, and you can put extra terms in the probability model that correspond to your prior knowledge. You can do all these things. And some people do that. If you actually want to, like if I work with an industrial partner, I'm going to use all of the knowledge that I have because I want to have something that works in the next 6 months. But if I want to solve AI, I think it's worth it to explore more general purpose methods. It could be combined with the prior knowledge. But to make the task of discovering these general purpose methods easier, to focus on this aspect, I find it interesting to actually avoid lots of very specific human knowledge. Although different researchers look at this differently.
J'aurais peut-être une question à mettre au bout de ça. Mon idée était, par exemple, si on traite des images, on pourrait avoir une partie de votre système qui est très bien à reconnaître que cette image-là a des ombres. Donc, dans notre recherche, dans un autre niveau, on pourrait dire, est-ce que je peux soustraire les paramètres que mon autre sous-niveau conceptualise comme étant des ombres ou du brouillard ou d'autres effets, si on pourrait dire, est-ce que je pourrais additionner, soustraire les modèles pour arriver à explorer cet espace-là?
You can do all kinds of things. There's lots of freedom to combine prior knowledge, and there are many different ways, and it's a subject of many different papers, to combine prior knowledge with learning. So you can do that. Sometimes, though, when you put too much prior knowledge, it hurts performance.
So how much does the network topology matters, and isn't that kind of the biological priors we were talking about in the very early slides, right? And isn't that the new kind of feature engineering of deep learning, right? Figuring out the right topology?
So the answer is no to both of these questions.
Nothing matters.
For example, the size of those layers doesn't matter much. I mean, it matters in the sense that they have to be big enough to capture the data. Regarding the link with biology,
because I was thinking, right, our brain comes wired in certain ways, right?
Yes,
because we have the
yes,
visual
yes.
cortex,
Yes,
sort
yes.
of like that. So
there might be things we will learn that we'll be able to exploit that might be generic enough in the brain, and we're on the lookout for these things.
Thanks.
We'll take two more questions.
Hi, so I'm interested in the results that adding random variation from getting into the result. So that reminds me of simulated annealing, where you try to avoid local minima.
Yeah.
So, but that literature also comes with a lot of annealing scheduling and such. So is that result imported into the field?
No, but you can see this trick is so simple I can write it in one line. So there's nothing complicated in this particular trick. You just add noise in a very dumb way and somehow it makes these networks more robust.
Well, with simulated annealing, they had
It's different from simulated annealing.
Oh,
it doesn't serve the same purpose.
You're also not
so
reducing
there's no
it.
minimization of energy of some sort.
Sorry?
I mean, when you're trying to get your result, you're minimizing the error, which is like energy minimization.
Yeah,
So
you're
they
still
have-
trying. You're trying to minimize the error, but under the perturbations created by this noise. So there is a connection with smooth continuum.
And it's a very rough connection at this point. But then for simulated annealing, it's not just doing random things. They also have like temperature decreasing, and then the end of the quenching rate and so on. So that's why.
So here it's not happening in the space of parameters that we're trying to optimize. So in simulated annealing, you're trying to do some optimization. Here, the noise is used as a regularizer, meaning it's injecting sort of a prior that your neural net should be kind of robust to half of it becoming dead. So it's a different way of using noise.
Okay, thanks.
Last question.
In the beginning, you were talking about priors
Yes.
that humans have in their brain.
Absolutely.
Okay, so how do you exploit that in your algorithm, or do you exploit that? So it's a general question.
Yes,
It's not so precise.
Well, I could
So-
speak for hours about that.
Yeah, okay, but then.
So the general.
So how do you exploit that in your algorithm?
Okay.
Or
So each
what
prior,
kind of-
that we consider is basically giving rise to a different answer to your question. So in the case of the sparsity prior I was mentioning, it comes about simply by adding a term in the log likelihood, adding a prior explicitly, or that's one way to do it. In the case of the prior that I mentioned the prior that the input distribution tells us something about the task, and we get it by sort of combining unsupervised learning and supervised learning. In the case of the prior that there are different abstractions that matter, different levels of abstraction in the world around us, we get the prior by having a structure in the model that has these different levels of representation. There are other priors that I didn't mention. For example, one of the priors that's really interesting that's been studied is the constancy prior, or the slowness. That the factors that matter, that explain the world around us, some of them change slowly over time. Like the set of people in this room is not changing very quickly right now. It's a constant over time. Eventually it will change. But there are properties of the world around us that remain the same for many time steps. And this is a prior which you can also incorporate in your model by changing the training criterion to say something like, well, some of the features in the representation should stay the same from t to t plus 1. This is very easy to put in, and it has been done, and there are many ways to do it. And so each prior, you can think of a way to incorporate it. Basically, it's changing the structure and changing the training criterion. Usually is the way we do it.
Okay, and which kind of prior do you think we humans have? I guess it's a very complex question.
Well,
I
that's
guess
what
I'm
I'm
asking for your
basically,
intuition.
what the question you're asking is the question I'm trying to answer.
Okay.
So I have some guesses. I mentioned a few already, and our research is basically about finding out what these priors are that are kind of generic and will work for many tasks in the world around us.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm going to shift and ask one last question. As software practitioners who are not machine learning experts, do you think it's worthwhile for us to learn a bit about machine learning?
Absolutely.
What's the starting point where we have a small problem, we want to spend 1 month working on this kind of thing? Where would be the starting point for us?
You have 1 month.
Yeah. So I mean, is there a library or something that you recommend?
You should take Jeff Hinton's Coursera course.
Yeah.
You can probably do it in 1 month because you're very smart.
There was also another one by Andrew and
Yes, Andrew Ng has a very good course, and there are more and more resources on the web to help people get started. There are libraries that people share, like the library from MATLAB that you can use to get started quickly. There are all kinds of resources like that.
And can you do it on a standard computer, or you need a cluster, or?
for the course.
It helps to have a cluster for training.
How big?
Once you have your trained model, usually you can run it on your laptop. And the reason you need a cluster is that these algorithms have so-called hyperparameters, many knobs that you want to set, and you want to explore many configurations of these knobs. But actually training one model can be done on a regular computer. It's just that you want to try many configurations of these knobs.
Thank you very much, Joshua, for this interesting talk.